Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the workers, of the owners, and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's event. As you may already know, we host hundreds of in person events along with our partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. So please check our website for a full list. But before we get started today, I'd like to ask all of you to please turn off or silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A, I would like to ask all of you who want to ask questions to please line up at the microphone over here by the pillar before asking your questions. It is my honor to introduce all of you to Michael E. Mann and Peter J. Hotez. Michael is a Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. He contributed to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize and was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2020. Peter is Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he's also the co director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. He is an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine and in 2022 was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on the COVID 19 vaccine. Tonight, they'll be discussing their book, Science Under Siege: How to Fight the Five Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. In this searing and important manifesto, Michael and Peter highlight the threat posed by political and ideological opposition to science. Publishers Weekly calls their book an impassioned critique, a call to action for scientists to get more involved in the political process and for concerned citizens to pay attention to the dangers of anti-science rhetoric. Everyone, let us all welcome Michael E. Mann and Peter J. Hotez.
Thank you.
Hello, thanks for coming out.
So, thanks everybody. It's great to see such a energetic crowd here. It at a very interesting time. I know we have a government shutdown here. I don't know if that helped us or hurt us here, but it does underscore sort of the moment that we're in right now, an unprecedented moment. And when Peter and I decided to write this book, keep in mind, this is about a year and a half ago. So we had no idea what sort of environment in which this book would actually come out. Let's just say when the edited
We knew it would
draft,
be bad. I don't think we thought it'd be this bad.
No, and when the edited draft came back in November at some point, we realized we had a lot of revision to do. And it was a struggle for us to make sure that the book was reasonably up to date, because just things were unfolding in real time, as you all know, at a pace that we never could have imagined. And so we wish this book was not as relevant as unfortunately it is today. And I think that's sort of that's the context in which
or as I sometimes say, I like to think that with the gradual slow wind down of COVID, my TV and media career would be over. But Mr. Kennedy seems determined to call me out of retirement and doing his best on that front.
Yeah, and we can talk about, we each have experiences with RFK Jr. My experiences were when he was an environmental activist a decade ago and had a radio show where he would invite climate scientists like myself to talk about the climate crisis. And now he's complaining about windmills in Wales after apparently having cut the head off of a whale at some point, as you may be aware. But suddenly he's now very concerned about whales being killed by windmills. And literally, they use the term windmills as if they're milling grain somewhere in the Netherlands. They're talking about wind turbines, and this idea that wind turbines are killing whales has no scientific backing whatsoever, and yet it has become a prevailing talking point that RFK Jr. himself is spouting, along with the sort of the anti-vax talking points.
Yeah, I mean, I think the top level view of the book is both Michael and I have been sort of on the front lines of combating two of the greatest existential threats to humankind. One of them being pandemic threats, and the other, of course, being the climate crisis. And it turns out that, and we spend a good part of chapter one talking about the two are tightly linked, because one of the reasons why we're seeing this big rise in pandemic threats is because of climate change and with mosquito-borne illness, and the fact that you might say, well, what does that have to do with coronaviruses and Ebola? And that's because these are natural viruses of bats, and with the altered temperatures and rainfall patterns, bats are seeking new habitats, coming closer to people, and the people are coming closer to the bats because of deforestation and urbanization. And so those two are linked. And so we talk about that 1-2 punch of climate change and pandemic threats as two of the greatest existential threats to humankind, but then say, guess what? There's a third leg to the tripod, and that third leg is this now vast anti-science disinformation ecosystem now that blocks us from responding. And the book, I think, is important because, too often we talk about it in terms of infodemic or misinformation, like it's just some random junk out there on the internet, and it's not. It's politically organized. It's making money hand over fist in a very corrupt way, and it's killing Americans in huge numbers, and it's starting to globalize from the U.S.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to provide some historical context. Some years ago, I did an event here for my book, The New Climate War, which was about the assault on climate action. And I sort of found myself in the climate wars 2.5 decades ago, back when my co-authors and I in the late 1990s published the so-called hockey stick curve that demonstrated the unprecedented nature of the warming of the past century. And it was perceived as a threat to some powerful vested interest, to the fossil fuel industry, because it really laid bare the profound impact that we were having on the planet. You didn't need to understand the physics of how a theoretical climate model works to understand what this curve was telling us, that there's something unprecedented happening today with our climate, and it's clearly related to the Industrial Revolution, the increase in carbon pollution from fossil fuel burning. And so as a young scientist, as a postdoctoral researcher who was not prepared to do combat in the public sphere, there's nothing in your scientific career that prepares you for getting into a hockey fight, if you will. And I quickly found my work, the hockey stick curve, being attacked, not criticized in the usual way that scientists appropriately criticize each other. Skepticism is a good thing in science. It's part of the self-correcting machinery that the great Carl Sagan, so eloquently described in his writings. That's a good thing in climate. But one-sided skepticism that involves the rejection of the overwhelming evidence based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't stand up to the slightest bit of scrutiny, that's not real skepticism. That's contrarianism or denial. And I realized that the attacks that I was experiencing were not part of the usual give and take, the appropriate give and take in science, that they were coming from talking heads on cable news programs and people who were associated with organizations or front groups funded by fossil fuel companies or funded by libertarian plutocrats of the sort that we talk about in the book. And so I found myself under attack in a way that you're not prepared for as a scientist. Efforts to discredit me personally as a way to try to discredit my science. And I spent, the better part of a decade and a half sort of fighting back against those attacks. Some of them here in Washington, D.C., against Congressman Joe Barton, a friend in the audience here who was involved in that particular battle, Republican senators, congressmen, and I say men because they were usually men, old white men, interestingly, trying to, discredit me. And gradually, sort of things, things moved on. They moved on from attacking me to attacking the efforts to solve the climate crisis, attacking renewable energy, attacking those proposing policy solutions. But I had sort of a bout of PTSD about 5 years ago when I saw people like Peter and Tony Fauci, public health scientists who devoted their life to helping people out, to curing diseases, to making us all better off. And I saw them being exposed to exactly the same sorts of attacks, the same tactics, the same players, the Koch brothers, the same plutocrats that had attacked me were attacking Peter, were attacking Tony. And I forget exactly, Peter and I can't remember who first contacted whom, but I think we were sort of drawn together because I felt like I had learned some lessons that I could share with Peter and Tony and my colleagues in the public health arena. And we reached out to each other. We became friends and colleagues, and we realized that, hey, we've got a book to write. And that's how this project came about. And it came about...
I think, yeah, we got connected because it was in June of 2023. I mean, we had been talking before, but I think I reached out to you. I can't remember. You reached out to me. I reached out to you. It was there was
can't remember anything during the COVID era.
Yeah,
actually.
well, there was, in 2023, there's this big pile-on where all of a sudden Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Joe Rogan and Elon Musk had this big pile-on and demanding that I debate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the Joe Rogan show about vaccines. And I was like, what the hell is this? And it's like every follower on Twitter except the ones following Taylor Swift. And, I was thinking, and I think I reached out to Mike, said, Mike, what is this? And he said, well, kind of been there, done that. And it was extremely helpful for me.
Yeah, I just want to say it's my favorite subsection heading in the whole book. And this is Peter's heading. Debate me, bro.
Yeah, and the way I got involved was kind of interesting. So I've always wanted to devote my life to making vaccines for tropical diseases, and I did a medical degree and a PhD, and did a pediatric residency in New York City at Rockefeller and University and Cornell, and then in Boston, and the hookworm vaccine that I started as an MD PhD student 40 years ago is now showing really high levels of protection in clinical trials. And so that's often how long it takes. And thanks. And then along the way, we made 2 low-cost COVID vaccines using the same technology that reached 100 million people in India and Indonesia, and provide a proof of concept that you don't have to be a big pharma company to still do big things in the vaccine space.
Public enemy number one here, folks.
Yeah, because that's what they call me, a pharma shill, when it's just the opposite. We found a path that you could actually bypass the big pharma companies. And I had great advisors, 2 very dear old friends I see in the back there, Stuart Simonson and Bruce Skellen, who've known me for almost that whole entire time. And that's what I wanted to do, and that was the plan. And it was something I thought was extremely noble. And then I think the big game changer, even before the Joe Rogan thing, was several years ago. I was in my office, and my assistant said, "Hey, Dr. Hotez, these 2 gentlemen are on the phone," and she's trying to read it. Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Francis Collins. Can you talk to them? And I was like, "Yeah, I think so." And they said, because what happened was, in addition to doing my MD and PhD in New York, I met my wife, Ann. We've been married now 38 years and putting up with me for a long time. And we have 4 kids, including Rachel, who's now an adult who has autism and intellectual disabilities, because you remember the original assertion was vaccines cause autism. So they said, look, Peter, we need you to talk to Bobby Kennedy. and explain to him, you're a parent, here you are, a vaccine scientist, a pediatrician, you're the parent of an adult daughter with autism, intellectual disabilities. You're going to talk them off the ledge, and we're going to arrange to have a series of conversations. We're going to have it mediated by a third individual, Tim Shriver, who's a Kennedy of sorts. Tim was great, and but a year of conversations. During that time talking to Bobby, and we can talk more about it, he was deeply dug in. He really couldn't care less about the science, but it caused me to look up everything, and all the notes from that went into writing a previous book called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. Well, that made me public enemy number 1 or 2 with anti-vaccine groups. And it built this very bizarre kind of parallel career for me. And now I realize that as important as the vaccines that we've made, 100 million doses administered, that's the first part, because now unless we do something about this very aggressive anti-vaccine activism, it won't matter, because these vaccines won't reach the people who need them. And I think that's what drives both of our passions is it's not just some kind of academic or arcane thing, right? People are dying because of this. 200,000 Americans died in the U.S. because they refused COVID vaccines in 2021 and 2022 during the Delta and BA1 Omicron wave. So it's anti-science activism itself is now a lethal force in the United States, and not small numbers.
Yeah, I mean, these are each existential threats. The climate crisis is an existential threat. The prospect of ever more deadly pandemics is an existential threat. And the overriding existential threat now is the massive spread of misinformation and disinformation, and the way that social media is now being weaponized for what our colleague Rene DiResta describes as infinite disinformation. Now with machine learning and AI, we're dealing with the prospect of infinite levels of disinformation. And that prevents us from being able to act on the climate crisis or pandemics or any of the great challenges that we face today. And so I think in writing this book, we realized that we had these parallel experiences in the climate domain and in the public health domain, where there were lessons that we could draw from our common experiences, but there was something deeper here. There was something deeper than this. It really gets at the war on information, the war on fact-based discourse, the war on objectivity, the war on democracy, the war on all of these ideals that we always felt were represented, were valued, were honored and cherished by the country that we grew up in. And each of us, have our ancestors fled from Europe during the pogroms. I think in your case, the same, around the same, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my parents fled. My grandparents fled Eastern Europe. I'm Jewish, and my all of my 4 grandparents are
I'm Jewish too, so this is part of the Jewish conspiracy here, as you can all see.
Yeah, we'll get to
George
that.
George Soros funded this book. Yes.
No, you got it wrong. I'm making the COVID virus with George Soros in a lab in Davos in the basement.
No, next door at Comet Pizza.
Yeah, right.
We have a workshop in the basement of Comet Pizza.
I mean, the interesting thing is, I never really consider myself a very political person, and I don't really care that much about your politics, and that's why it's hard to talk about how do you uncouple the politics, because it's killing so many Americans. I see my sister-in-law in the back there, who's my wife's sister, and who's known me a long time. And Julie, I don't know, you don't think of me as a very political person, do you? I mean, She was former chief of staff for Senator Mikulski and assistant secretary in the State Department, and has put up with me for a long time, mostly putting her up in her apartment when I'm visiting Washington. How this is, I think, one of the hardest things to do, is because it's not that we're deeply, at least I'm not deeply passionate about the politics. I say, but don't adopt this stuff because it's going to kill you. And as I said, 200,000 Americans died because they refused COVID vaccines, 40 to 50,000 in my state of Texas. Now, It's spilled over now to childhood immunizations. We just got through an 8-month measles epidemic that started in West Texas, up in the Panhandle, 4 states. 100 kids got hospitalized because their parents didn't vaccinate them. 2 school-age kids died because they didn't vaccinate 2 otherwise perfectly healthy school-age kids. And it's not stopping. It's now extending to all. It's going to extend to all childhood immunizations. And unfortunately, now we have this man who's head of Health and Human Services, who every couple of weeks comes up with a new zinger. Right? First, he's resurrecting the autism stuff and talking about autism in such dark terms. Right? He wants to create a registry. Which is really creepy. Saying that kids on the autism spectrum can't use the toilet, and they talks about it in most apocalyptic terms that they can't pay taxes and they can't work. And Rachel, my daughter, has got intellectual disabilities, but she walks to Goodwill every day, and she loves working and pays taxes and is proud to pay taxes and get a paycheck. And
I'm confused. I thought they were against taxes. I'm a little confused here.
And then, he moves to the whole false equivalency, and he's changed his rhetoric a bit. And this is the next leg of the anti-vaccine movement, the anti-science movement. So it started out with autism, then took political ramifications around these libertarian concepts of health freedom, medical freedom. Now the third converging thread is a very corrupt health, wellness, and influencer industry. And have you ever wondered why they're all anti-parasitic drugs? Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, fenbendazole. It's because you can buy them in bulk, as cheap generics, and then you jack up the price, repackage it, and sell it with a $1,600 telehealth visit. And so now Mr. Kennedy has changed his rhetoric since I last talked to him. And this is what he says. So you can either get the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or you can get this cocktail of supplements, vitamin A, budesonide. You all heard of vitamin A, budesonide, clarithromycin. You're saying, where does that come from? Well, it's the health wellness influencer industry, which is unfortunately what MAHA has become, an economic stimulus plan for the health wellness and influencer industry. And it's profoundly corrupt, but it also, for the business model to work, it has to attack the science. And it has to attack the scientist. And you see the leaders of these companies, portraying us or portraying me as public enemies or cartoon villains, and then the big pile-on and the death threats, and come on social media, the emails and the stalkings and everything else.
Yeah, one of the things that was interesting as we were writing this book together, we were trying to understand why is it that some of the same principal actors, like the Koch brothers or some of these fossil fuel interests, it's understandable why they have tried to undermine the clean energy transition, why they have tried to undermine climate science, which is the reason that we need a clean energy transition. That's understandable. Why is it that some of these same actors were going after public health science? We're trying to undermine the faith in the public health community, trying to undermine the faith in vaccines. And there's some interesting historical footnotes that are important to understand how this all arose. So there was the Great Barrington Declaration early on during, I see people nodding, people who are aware of this in the audience. I grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts, not far from Great Barrington. I had friends from Great Barrington. We used to run cross country against the folks from, I'm sure they are embarrassed to have their name connected with this thing. I can promise you that. But it was a front group really for the sort of anti-vax, anti-public health movement. And early on, it was funded. So the Great Barrington Declaration was funded by a group that's connected to the Koch brothers and to these dark money organizations, the same plutocrats that fund climate denial. We understand why they fund climate denial. Why are they funding this stuff? Well, early on, they were threatened with the prospect of decreased energy usage, decreased fossil fuel usage for transportation, for energy. There was a decrease in fossil fuel usage associated with the lockdowns and the stay-at-home orders. They didn't want an economic slowdown. They didn't want these measures to be in place because that was going to decrease the use of fossil fuels and the profits that they gain from them. The Koch brothers are the world, or Koch brother, there's just one of them now. Actually, there's also, there's Charles, but there's also William Koch. There's some other Kochs. We normally talk about David and Charles as being the two principal funders of this sort of libertarian, these front groups, libertarian front groups. But the Koch brothers were, you know, the Koch Industries, the largest privately held fossil fuel interest. They didn't want a slowdown in fossil fuel usage, and so they created this movement to convince the public and policymakers that we don't need to put any of these measures in place. They needed to undermine faith and belief in the public health community to do that.
And meanwhile, we were seeing surges on emergency rooms and ICUs, and the ICU docs are saying you got to slow it down because as the ICUs start overwhelming the staff, it's not really the bed so much, it's the trained staff. Mortality shooting way up, and that's why we had to kind of keep it down. Michael,
Oh, I was just going to one more, just to complete the thought. So why did they become anti-vaxxers? Because they created this community, this rabble, that was unwilling now to believe that anything that the public health scientists had to say, and that necessitated the sort of rejection of the need for vaccination. And so that's why that movement, that ideological community, is now opposed to vaccines. And that's an important historical footnote.
Before we finish our time talking to Q&A, do you want to just, since you're started on the first P, the plutocrats, do you want to, you're so good at giving the rundown of the 5 Ps, and it was Michael's idea, the 5 Ps anyway.
I'm a sucker for alliteration.
That and the Tolkien,
so.
and any of the Tolkien you read, that's all.
I'm a big Tolkien fan, I admit it. And I do think that we are facing what can only be described as a Tolkien-esque moment right now for humanity. So it just felt like the right framing as we closed the book, as a closing message for the book. And there's some hopeful messages that come out of that framing. And we quote, there's a line about, there are some good things in this world and they're worth fighting for. And I think that remains sort of a guiding principle. As dark as things may seem at times, there's something to be said for fighting the good fight. And there's something to be said for, trying to save the beauty and wonder of this world that we live in and preserving our planet for future generations, for children and grandchildren. So it felt like an appropriate framing to us. But the 5 Ps, and there are actually more Ps, more than enough Ps to fill a pod, really. So they're the plutocrats. We've talked about a little bit about them. Elon Musk, Rupert Murdoch, the Koch brothers, etc. There are the petrostates, Russia and Saudi Arabia, who have done everything they can to defeat any global action on climate. Turns out there's an interesting connection between petrostates and authoritarian states, and authoritarian regimes often tend to have these sort of anti-science views that are, that all carry over to public health as well. So they're the petrostates. Russia, Saudi Arabia, I mentioned. The United States. Right now, we can only describe the United States as a petrostate. Our policies are completely, right now, the head of one of these Koch-funded organizations is the former head of one of these Koch-funded front groups is the head of the Office of Management and Budget. He met with Donald Trump today to talk about how they can use the government shutdown to basically defund all of the clean energy programs that the previous administration had funded. And so we are a petrostate. We are part of that petrostate alliance right now. Then there are the propagandists and the pros, and that's self-explanatory. These are the talking heads that get paid to promote the misinformation, the disinformation, to spread it on social media. Those petrostates, Russia and Saudi Arabia, there's a reason that they leveraged Elon Musk's buyout of Twitter, because they wanted to weaponize Twitter, what had been sort of a public square for the promotion of scientific information to the public and policymakers. They wanted to weaponize it for their own purposes. And then finally, there's the press. And we sort of take a no-holds-barred approach here, because of course we're talking about the Murdoch media, the right-wing press, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal editorial
And we
pages.
document how Fox News's role and the specific propaganda they promoted during the pandemic. Every night, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham,
Absolutely.
Sean Hannity filled their broadcasts, not only pushing back against vaccine mandates, which you could sort of understand, but also bringing on all of these toxic talking heads to discredit the effect, to lie and basically try to discredit the effectiveness and safety of COVID vaccines. So if you're watching those three anchors every night, and are watching Joe Rogan podcasts where he really started pushing the agenda of the wellness nutritional supplement industry and the ivermectin, you went down that rabbit hole and you made an executive decision based on what you were hearing, and you paid for it with your life.
No, absolutely, and we so. Obviously, there's the right-wing media and the misinformation and disinformation that they spread. And when Fox News isn't spreading disinformation about vaccines, they're spreading disinformation about clean energy and climate, right? It's an equal opportunity anti-science approach that they have taken. And they have done tremendous damage. And the global network, the Murdoch Media Network, has, which, with close ties to Saudi Arabia, petrostate, has done tremendous damage to science-based progress in either of these areas. So we understand that's pretty clear. It's obvious that the conservative media, if we can call them that, the right-wing media, whatever we want to call them, it takes much of the blame. But we also criticize some of the legacy media for what we describe as performative neutrality, a tendency, and not so much the science reporters at these newspapers who do a good job, I would say, even at the Wall Street Journal, generally do a good job, but the political reporters and the opinion page, where anti-science, where the lab leak theory is often presented as if it is an equally credible theory to the zoonotic spillover theory, where there is a wealth of peer-reviewed literature that supports the latter. There's none that supports the former, and yet they are treated on an equal basis, and that gives the public this. It also undermines public, belief and acceptance of what scientists have to say. Well, the scientists don't agree; they're different. How do we know who to blame, and who wins when people throw up their hands in confusion and defeat? We don't know who to believe. Well, then they're prone to the forces of misinformation.
And now this is being weaponized. You hear now our heads of our scientific agencies say, now we're going to implement gold standard science. It's all BS, right? I mean, what do you think has been going on for the last 100 years of these agencies? Nothing but gold standard science. What they really are pushing are gold standard pseudoscience and gaslighting you into thinking that before that wasn't real science. So and you're seeing it manifest in multiple ways. You're seeing Mr. Kennedy trying to shut down biomedical journals or create this false equivalency. They create these WordPress documents that sort of look journally, with the editorial boards, but it's all of his, so it's this parallel universe now that is being set up. And that's where the cuts to the NIH and the NSF are. And that's where you hear, well, people don't trust the scientists anymore. Well, the reason people may not trust the scientists is because those individuals went on Fox News every night to create that distrust. And so and again, I don't know what a better term to use. It's gaslighting, or but it's very effective and it's very, very powerful. I mean, I don't know how many Zoom conferences I've been on over the last year on trust in science, as though we did something wrong. I mean, during a pandemic, communication is always going to be imperfect. And I can, if we had the time, I'd cite chapter and verse of every single thing we got wrong. But you know what? It wasn't all that bad. But it was the bad actors who, were weaponizing it at every turn of the way.
I mean, the gold standard science, it's Orwellian, right? Because it's actually taking the framing of science, the language of science, and trying to sell pseudoscience and anti-science using that language, actually advocating for the very opposite of what science really, how science really works, how objective science really works. And I like to think that that gold in the gold standard science is recycled from the gold toilets that Donald Trump owns, as we know. We've seen photos of that. So they've made use of that gold. One of the things that is also really important here is this idea of sowing mistrust in institutions, sowing mistrust in authority, sowing mistrust in scientists, because in an atmosphere where people don't feel like they can, where there are no authoritative sources, there are no objective sources, they don't know who to trust. That is an atmosphere, an environment in which the forces of anti-science flourish. They exploit that uncertainty, they exploit that confusion, and they have an agenda that they're happy to advance by exploiting that. So I guess we should end up, we should finish. We want to save quite a bit of time for questions. But we do try to provide a path forward, what we see as a path forward. And Peter can talk about some of the specifics because they involve, for example, getting scientists more involved, more scientists like us. There shouldn't just be a handful of scientists out there doing this. We should create room, create incentives for other scientists who have a passion to do this, who have an interest, a proclivity, so that they have opportunities to do this as well. There's strength in numbers. We need far more scientists out there doing this. But ultimately, all of the things that are happening because we have ceded our government to the plutocrats. And they are now implementing the agenda that they said they would implement. This doesn't come as a surprise. If you read Project 2025, if you read Project 2025, what they're doing is exactly what they said they would do. We just didn't realize they would be able to execute this as quickly as they have. And in part, that's because many of our institutions have folded under this pressure. And that's, to me, the scariest thing of all. But the situation we find ourselves in also points to the solution. We're in this situation because not enough people who care about the things that we care about, who care about what sort of world we leave behind for our children, grandchildren, turned out in that last presidential election. And elections, as a politician friend of mine once said, have consequences. In this last presidential election had fundamental consequences. We are seeing those consequences. There's still an opportunity to right this ship. There's a midterm election that's only a year away, which could provide a major check, which could at least stem the bleeding, as it were. And so there is still an opportunity. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, and Peter can talk about how this applies in the public health arena. When it comes to climate change, there's this sense of doom and despair out there. And there's this misconception that we have somehow gone past the point of no return, that it's too late to do anything to reduce our carbon emissions and to avoid crossing into catastrophic levels of planetary warming. And that doomism and despair is being weaponized by bad actors because they want you dispirited. They want you to throw up your hands in defeat and say, oh, I guess there's nothing we can do. And that applies to the climate crisis, but it applies to the preservation of our democracy and everything else that we care about. And so that is a theme that we sort of dwell on in the book, that the obstacles here aren't, in the case of climate, for example, they're not physical, they're not technological. We have the technology to decarbonize our world. They are political, and political obstacles can be overcome.
I'll just say before you're over for questions, I think part of the issue is the scientists themselves are invisible, and that creates a vacuum that allows the bad actors to portray us as sort of nefarious figures in white coats plotting all sorts of terrible things. There are our colleagues at Research America, which is a policy group based here in D.C., does these surveys every couple of years, and they come up always with the same numbers. They ask two questions for the American people. One, can you name a living scientist? Question one. Question two, can you name an institution where biomedical research is conducted? And it turns out the vast majority of Americans, over 75%, cannot name a living scientist.
And the 25% who can name Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson, and there's nothing wrong. And I love them to both.
We
And
love
those
Bill.
two.
We are friends of Bill.
But
Okay.
but the issue is they're not working scientists in the sense that we are, right? Struggling over major revisions of papers and grants that don't get discussed at study section and what goes on at a scientific meeting, and that's by design. I think part of the problem is the research university heads, the heads of the academic health centers, are so fiercely protective of their brand that they don't really encourage their docs and scientists to speak out. Or what they'll do is say, hey, you're an academic, you're free to speak out, ... but don't screw this up and get the institution in trouble. And of course, if you're out there enough like we are, you will screw up and you will get the institution in trouble, I can guarantee, but you have to know, we have their backing, and it's not quite in the DNA yet. And again, and by the way, nobody can name an institution where biomedical research is conducted. When they finally get around to naming one, it's usually St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, because they do so much advertising, which does great work, no question about it. But they have a huge advertising budget. So, so how do we? So I think that, and not every scientist wants to be out there and doing public engagement. That's fine too. But for those who do, we have to find ways to enable that and make people feel comfortable without the sort of Damocles over their head.
Yeah, and we have to have courage. We have to create space for younger scientists so that they feel comfortable in doing this. And so that's sort of, to me, that's the most important thing that I think Peter and I can do, is to try to provide an example to younger scientists that, hey, you can be out there doing this, you can still do good science, you can still publish in the leading journals, and you can be out there explaining the science and its implications to the public and policymakers. In fact, there's no more noble thing that you can do as a scientist and a citizen than to do that.
Thank you. So happy to take questions.
Hi.
Yeah. Just identify yourself and
Alan Loeb. Thank you for coming out, first off.
Thanks.
So I haven't yet read your book. Sounds very interesting. But the thing that comes to me by listening to what you have to say is that by putting these two areas of science together, you're saying that there must be something in common going on that links the two of them. And you gave some hypotheses about what that might be. So the thing I want to know is, I can remember far enough back that there was a time when if you said something in the news and it didn't make any sense, that there would be blowback and somebody would say, well, that doesn't make any sense, and then you would be discredited for saying it. But the thing that seems to be going on now is people say ridiculous things and nobody seems to, nobody says, what they say instead is, wow, that was really great. What a novel, idea. So I'm wondering if you can address maybe some themes that might explain why the public is more receptive to garbage than it used to be. I have my own idea. I think everybody is lead poisoned from the use of leaded gasoline, but maybe you have some ideas that you'd like to express.
I'll just say one brief statement, and then
Thanks for that comment.
Handle the most
Question.
important part of the question. I think part of the problem is, a lot of the talking heads that are pushing this disinformation themselves are professors at important medical schools or research universities. They're not professors in that subject, but they feel at ease talking about something that they have no qualifications. And the problem is the universities, don't want to rein them in because of academic freedom. But to which I say, well, okay, I get academic freedom, but we also have something in universities called professionalism and ethics. And that's what seems to have gone out the window, or they've intimidated university administrators into invoking something called professionalism and ethics. And it was nonstop with some of these talking heads on Fox News. One of them, who's very high up in the Trump administration, would go after me on Fox News and say, well, of course, Hotez is in the secret cabal with Fauci. He has funding from the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases of the U.S. National Institutes of Health. Well, hell, his whole department of microbiology, where he was funded by NIID, and it was so disingenuous. But there was no accountability. No one would take him into a room and say, "What the heck are you doing?" And
Yeah, I would just adding to that. I mean, there is this infrastructure that's been created decades in the making. The sort of conservative ideological community has created this very elaborate infrastructure. My colleague Naomi Oreskes, who co-authored Merchants of Doubt, describes this as a Potemkin village of seemingly authoritative sounding organizations and groups that are all traced typically to like the same P.O. box in Washington, D.C. They're funded by dark money organizations. There is this illusion of widespread support for these contrarian views about climate change, these contrarian views about vaccines and public health. There is an infrastructure for getting that information out. And I talked about the way that social media has been weaponized when Elon Musk, and we talk about this, took over Twitter. Again, a buyout that was leveraged by Saudi Arabia and Russia. The algorithm was tweaked so that suddenly anti-science accounts were getting far more purchase, far more attention, far more prominence, and actual scientists who had prominent voices in that social media platform in the past suddenly had much reduced reach. And so you can simply change the algorithm in a way that diminishes the voice of scientists and enhances the voice of anti-scientists. So they had a plan. As I said, we've talked about Project 2025, but this plan goes back decades. All of the conservative think tanks that have been established over the years, they played the long game. They created an infrastructure. They're now buying out much of our media. Conservative plutocrats, one by one, are buying out our social media platforms, which are increasingly the most important. TikTok is about to go to one of them, the most important way to reach younger people who, by the way, voted in surprisingly high numbers in this last election for Republicans in a way they had never done before. And we talk in the book, you interview some of these people, you ask them about their view, who voted for Donald Trump, young like Hispanic men who voted inordinately for Republicans in this last election. And you ask them about their views about climate change, and they're spouting climate change denial propaganda. It's clear what their information ecosystem is. It's clear that they're listening to these podcasts. And many of you have probably seen this map of like the 50 leading podcasts in terms of reach, colored red and blue, and the size of the bubble is the impact, is the reach. And the progressive are the blue and conservative are the red. And the whole map is basically big red bubbles with a few small blue ones. They have been staking out ground. They have been expanding their reach. They have been reaching voters that were difficult to reach, that they were able to turn out through unconventional means, through advertising on gaming platforms and reaching voters who would otherwise. So why is all this happening? It's because there is a very highly motivated, extremely well-funded movement to make it happen. And yes, we can try to use the mechanisms available to us to push back, but we have to recognize, the enemy that we're fighting.
And it's having the bandwidth. So, for instance, a few months ago, the Florida Surgeon General, who's a very dyed, hard-in-the-wool anti-vaxxer, comes out and says that mRNA vaccines are causing turbo cancer because they're contaminated with nucleic acid that's inserting into our genome next to oncogenes and activating cancers. And that sounds very sciencey, right? Until you realize that's all fake, right? First of all, there's no such thing as a turbo cancer. Right? It's a made-up term. Second, the lipid nanoparticle that delivers the nucleic acid past the cell membrane stays in the cytoplasm. It doesn't get past the nuclear membrane into the nucleus. For that, you need electroporation. That's why we have no DNA vaccines licensed. And then even if some contaminating DNA were to get in, we have interferon-inducible proteins of our innate immune system that block incorporation of foreign nucleic acid into our genome. Otherwise, every time we ate a hamburger, we'd have cow DNA going into our genome. And here's the problem. So, okay, I go on MSNBC and I go on CNN and PBS NewsHour, and guess what? I'm not reaching the people I need to reach, right? Because they're all watching Joe Rogan podcasts and
Yeah, I thought the nanocancer stuff was pretty convincing. I don't know.
and this is the frustration. I was going on Fox News early on in the pandemic, and then when I refused to go along with the hydroxychloroquine nonsense coming out of the West Wing of the White House, the invitation stopped. And
Next question, yeah.
My name is Kevin. I agree with the hydroxychloroquine thing. It took like 3 years to do a study to prove that it didn't have any positive effect. And I heckled the witch doctor, whatever they called them, frontline doctors, when they were in front of the Supreme Court when John Lewis's hearse came by. And I thought it was disrespectful, but I didn't need to see the study to know that it probably wasn't a
this was an organization of far-right physicians who were organized and Phi Latipo is part of that, by the way.
But regarding the ethics, when Francis Collins was at Davos, Jeremy Farrar was the head scientist at the World Health Organization, organized a meeting that came to a so-called consensus and included I think Peter Daszak wasn't in it, but Peter Daszak was the guy that proposed the experiment that resulted in COVID. And Peter Daszak and Jeremy Farrar were business partners in Vietnam in 2008, and that was in U.S. Right to Know. Emily Kopp was the first to report that. So
we got a long line. Can you give us a
Yeah, but
question?
you're also citing some disinformation sources.
I'm just saying,
and let me just
for
say,
ethical scientists disclose their relationship with people that do unethical experiments and fault in leaky labs. So Peter Daszak.
But except that, I'll just say,
sorry, we need a question.
Let me just say
We need a
one: those
question.
experiments,
Okay, so-
those experiments were never done. First of all, and second, the National Defense Intelligence Director has come out with the summary statement saying that gain of function had no role in COVID origins. And so, all right, let's move on.
Sorry, we've got a long line of people here. We really do need to move on. Thanks. Yeah, they're required to, and they do. Thanks.
We do, yes.
So my name is Kyle. I'm a physicist, a working research scientist. So thank you for everything you've done. So I wanted to know if you guys have any thoughts on how. So I work at Goddard, and recently I think a lot of people at NASA, a lot of people who do space science, have been afforded the luxury of it being largely an apolitical, nonpartisan thing until the last 6 months or so. And so I think you find a lot of people with astronomy and physics backgrounds being like, oh, I don't have to think about this politics, this social media, all of this stuff. Like, and then when they are presented with it, they're like, oh, this isn't logical. I don't understand why these people are doing this. And they just want like an explanation. So I didn't know if you guys have any tips or tricks or things to, reach out to your fellow academics who are just like, why are these people being so irrational? It doesn't make sense. And then just like go back to their computer or something,
Yeah, thanks. It's sort of like first they came for the earth scientists and
right. Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And like Goddard does a lot of earth science, as you probably are aware. Yeah.
And then they came for the physicists, and there was nobody left to. I mean, that's really the worry, right? And we talk in the book, and Peter might want a fair amount about the lessons we can learn from some of the horrific anti-science anti-science episodes in the past, in particular during Stalinist Russia, the episode of Lysenkoism, and it's sort of a textbook example of how dangerous it is when science, any area of science, becomes politicized, when certain areas of science are promoted for political reasons, and people who don't agree with the convention, the prevailing political view end up, getting thrown into gulags.
Well, I'd just say, one of the interesting behaviors that I've seen is someone as a talking head will, start going up against, pushing anti-science, pseudoscience about one area, and over the next few months, you see them now buying the whole farm. So it's everything, and so they basically meld together, and so one has to believe that it's climate science, it's vaccines, it's pandemic threats today, but they're going to go after CRISPR-Cas9. They're going to go after you name it, the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. So it's just a matter of time.
Exactly. And let me give you just one example that actually connects our two areas together. RFK Jr., of course, is well known for promoting anti-vax propaganda and anti-science in the public health arena. But a few weeks ago, you may remember that he was spouting this myth that, whales are being killed by wind turbines. And, he was once a champion of climate action. He was a lawyer for the Natural Resources Defense Council. He was a climate activist. And here he is now sort of trying to discredit renewable energy. And it's because he is taking the party line. If he has to hold an anti-science view on climate now that goes completely against everything he once believed, then he's going to do so because he needs to be a loyal member of the tribe. And so every area of science is vulnerable once you start adopting the idea that science can be rejected for purely ideological reasons. I'll give you another example. Elon Musk, who was this great savior who was bringing solar panels and electric vehicles to the world and was going to was leading the clean energy transition. And now he actually parrots climate denial talking points on Twitter, and he promotes the assault on clean energy. And so, it's anti-science is contagious, I guess, to use a medical or analogy there. And no area of science is safe once you start going down this path.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mike Albro. I'm a physicist, and I've been doing physics research at CERN, actually, in Geneva, which was a European lab. Now it's a global lab, basically, with 10,000 physicists working and engineers all over the world working there. Now, I've given talks about particles for peace. It's a force for peace in the world. The international dimension is critical, and now we see the danger of that because the National Science Foundation has been decimated. And I can imagine Trump saying, why are we spending money in Geneva, Switzerland? Pull out of that, which would be a major disaster. So anyway, what the question is, they're coming for the physicists. Okay. I'm not sure what my question is, but the comment is that the international dimension and the peace, soft force, soft power is so important here.
Yeah, thanks for that point. It's one of the things people ask me, they ask, does this mean the end of climate science? Trump's and the Republicans' defunding of climate science, of NSF, of climate programs, DOE and EPA sort of climate science programs. They're doing everything they can to basically pull all of the funding for climate science. Is this a threat to climate science writ large? And my answer is, at this point, all the United States gets to decide is if it's going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. The rest of the world is going to move on. I just came back from Hong Kong, and I'm amazed at the science that they're doing right now. They're not slowing down. They're moving ahead, both on the climate science front, on the clean energy front. China is now leading in this area, and so the rest of the world will continue on. Sure, there are going to be discontinuities in measurement platforms that are going to be problematic because we like to have consistent, continuous climate records. There's going to be they're trying to defund the Mauna Loa CO2 observatory because they don't want a continuous CO2 record that shows CO2 climbing ever high. They're trying to defund the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City because it's this iconic lab on top of Tom's Diner of Seinfeld fame, where James Hansen first projected the warming that we would be seeing, that we are now seeing. So all that they get to determine is whether we are part of the forward progress of science going forward, whether we are not.
But the big issue now for me is, looking at the young scientists in our laboratories, the graduate students, the postdocs, the postdoctoral fellows, the junior faculty. I mean, they look at me like, Moses in the desert. Why did you bring us here? And yeah, right. And how do you give them hope? You don't want to just say, "Well, move to France," right? You want to be able to give them something to hang on to, and it's tough. I mean, I say, look, there will be significant federal cuts to science, both through the NIH, NSF, other agencies. I think that's pretty inevitable. So how can you find other sectors, whether it's through biotech and industry, and maybe we need to have our doctoral students learn a little bit more about how to be more entrepreneurial, starting biotech companies, learning the private equity space, and I've written a couple of papers on that, and they're not great papers because I'm sort of flailing too, trying to figure this out with the rest of them. And the weakness of the argument, of course, is if the cuts to government science are prolonged or sustained, then even the biotech sector starts to shrivel, right? Because you do need a pipeline of innovation. So I realized that after I got the paper accepted. I should.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think it's a very long. I don't know the answer to your question.
Maybe we should do like some rapid fire question and answer. We'll keep it short because I see there's still a number of people who are. So.
By the way, you can always. I won't speak for Michael, but you can always email me. The anti-vaxxers have my email. You can have it too. It's just Hotez, last name at BCM. It stands for Baylor College of Medicine.edu. But just put in the subject line, you're part of this, because you can imagine what my inbox looks like.
Yeah, me too. You can email Peter as well. No. Feel free to reach out.
Well, thank you for being here. I'm Sylvia Cho. I work at the NIH, and obviously today with shutdown and everything, I'm here on my personal capacity. But what I guess you started answering a question that I've been wondering. So I study health misinformation and generally the information ecosystem. I can say today you cannot possibly even apply for a grant. They have a way of screening for everything you've talked about here, climate change, vaccine, hesitancy, misinformation. Either they're getting terminated or they wouldn't even get through because they're not ideologically aligned with agency priorities. So my question is more, you're talking about encouraging scientists to continue this work. If you want to try to come into NIH, you can't do this work. So kind of, how do you reimagine an ecosystem where we can sort of keep young people still excited and not lose hope and continue this work? And I'll just say I'm here with a lot of others who are Bethesda Declaration signers. We're named signers who are, so you can find them. So thank you.
How is that different from the Great Barrington Declaration? Are they the same thing? Are they?
One thing we have in common is we believe in academic freedom. According to them, they say they do. I don't know if it's true, but
it's the black is white, up is down.
Oh yeah, we don't get paid.
Yeah, no, exactly. Very,
thank you for your work and of course the great work of the National Institutes of Health.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll just one thing I'll say about the National Institutes of Health, paid for my MD and PhD. And so I came out of Rockefeller and Cornell with zero debts, and they even gave me a stipend to live on. It was $5,000, wasn't much, but for me it was great, and that allowed me to devote my life to making low-cost vaccines, reaching 100 million people. It wouldn't have happened without the National Institutes of Health, and I think I'm not alone in those stories. So
no, I've benefited from NIH funding. My wife is a life scientist.
Yeah, so I really genuinely want to know, what's next. Like if NIH can't fund so much of this important work, especially, when you're going from discovery to actually saving lives, who is going to do it, how we're going to do it. And I know that's not a question you can answer in a few minutes, but I think that's an important one for us to ponder. So thank you.
I wrote this paper, Your Career in U.S. Biosciences, looking at some of the alternatives, and at least it's a start. You want to take a look at it?
Hi, I am retired from the National Science Foundation. And I feel very fortunate that I'm retired these days. I have a question for each one of you, and I'll be very, very quick. Okay, for Dr. Hotez, now I'm blanking. Why don't people in your position spend more time talking about people having a moral obligation to protect their family and their neighbors from getting diseases, and that be the reason to get vaccinated? I don't hear a lot about that you do it because you want to protect others. Okay, that's for you. For you, I was really pleased to see that New Yorker piece where it talked about 86 climate scientists taking apart, shredding apart a Department of Energy report, and I was really pleased to see that. I know of one particular climate denier who gets a lot of attention, and what I don't see is people with expertise taking him down. There needs to be like some kind of formal framework where people get together and they say, look, he's come out with this piece, who's going to take it apart and show where he's wrong? Okay, and it's just, and I can't do it. I'm not, I may have worked at NSF, but I'm not a scientist. But people in your group, they don't think it's important expenditure of their time to take down these people who get a lot of publicity in the places that they work.
Yeah, so let me speak to that one first, and then Peter can speak to the other one. So in fact, I co-founded back in 2005 a website, realclimate.org, with my colleague Gavin Schmidt, who's the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City that's been kicked out of their laboratory, their 30-year-old laboratory now by the Trump administration. But we've co-founded this website because back in 2005, we felt there was a need for actual practicing climate scientists to push back against the misinformation being promoted by climate change deniers. So that site is still actively doing just what you're describing. There are other websites that do that as well. One of my favorite is, it used to be called Climate Feedback. It's now called Science Feedback. They've sort of broadened their scope, but they take on the various myths of the day. In fact, when that EPA report that you referred to, or the DOE report, this disinformative DOE report by a number of climate contrarians that was published a couple months ago now, almost immediately, Science Feedback had a response where they interviewed some of the leading scientists in the field, and each of them responded to the major claims that were being made. One of the most remarkable things I've ever seen is the National Academy of Sciences turning around a report in a matter of weeks. They put out a report debunking the claims made in that Trump administration DOE report in just a few weeks. I've been involved with National Academy reports in the past. There are several rounds of review. There's a revision process. I can't imagine them doing that, but they did it, and it was longer than the DOE report itself, and it really deconstructed that report in great detail. Part of the problem is that the misinformation, so they're still making policy. The Trump administration is making policy. They're saying, hey, we've got a document, we've got a report, and it's official government report. They disbanded the group, but they've got that report, and they are now trying to implement policy. They don't care about the truth. They just care that they can claim that there's a report. So there is the impact on the policy discussion, and scientists can do quite a bit to push back and to make sure that there is appropriate media coverage of the debunking of those claims. But there's also the policy damage that's being done, and that's the real intent here.
Yeah, and the problem is there's no feedback loop. There's no autocorrection like there used to be. In the past, if there was a measles epidemic in your neighborhood because measles vaccination rates had declined, you'd hear about kids going into the hospital or the ICU, and there would be a catch-up campaign. Now, after 40,000 people in my state of Texas needlessly died because they refused the COVID vaccine, what the response is, it's doubling down and trying to say, no, it was the COVID vaccines that killed people in my state, not the virus. It's absolute nonsense, and this is the power of the disinformation machine.
Thank you.
We should probably wrap up.
Maybe one or two more, and then we should wrap it up. Yep.
That is the end of our questions time.
Okay.
Yes.
There you are.
Round of applause